It was a quiet Saturday evening in the hills of Tucson, Arizona. The kind of night where the air smells like desert sage and the stars look close enough to touch. The kind of night where you can hear a neighbor's wind chimes 2 houses down and the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the foothills. The kind of night that feels, in every possible way, safe, ordinary, predictable. The kind of night that makes you believe, truly believe, that nothing bad ever really happens in a place like this. An 84-year-old woman named Eleanor had spent the evening the way she spent most evenings, laughing over dinner with her daughter, talking about her grandchildren, asking about school recitals and soccer games and who said what at church last Sunday, watching the lights flicker on one by one across the valley as the sun went down behind the mountains. She was the kind of woman who noticed those things. The lights coming on, the sky shifting from orange to purple to dark blue. The small, quiet beauty of an ordinary evening. She had spent decades learning to find joy in those small things, and she was still finding it, right up until that night. Her daughter dropped her off at home just before 10 o'clock. They hugged at the car door the way people do when they live close and see each other often, a warm hug, not a desperate one. The kind of goodbye that assumes another hello is already scheduled. Eleanor walked to her front door, turned the handle, and paused just long enough to wave. Her daughter watched her go inside. Then she drove away. That was the last time anyone who loved her would see her walking freely under those desert stars. That wave at the front door. That ordinary, unremarkable, completely innocent goodbye. That is the image her family would carry with them in the weeks and months that followed. That wave. That door closing. That silence. At 2:28 in the morning, Eleanor's pacemaker stopped syncing with her Apple devices. Not because the battery died. Not because of a storm. Not because of a technical glitch or a software update or a moment of ordinary mechanical failure. It simply went silent. And in that silence, in those still, black hours when the rest of the neighborhood was asleep, something happened inside that house that would shake an entire nation and leave a family begging the world for help. 8 minutes later, a vehicle appeared on a back road 2.5 miles from Eleanor's home, moving fast, faster than anyone should be moving through a quiet residential neighborhood in the middle of the night. 12 vehicles total would pass through that same stretch of road between midnight and sunrise, but one of them was different. One of them did not belong. And somewhere in the gap between that silent pacemaker and that speeding car, in those 8 minutes, an 84-year-old grandmother disappeared. By the time the morning sun rose over the Catalina hills, Eleanor was gone, and for the people who loved her most, her daughters, her son, her grandchildren, the world would never quite look the same again. Before we go any further in this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Drop your city and your state. We love seeing where this community is tuning in from all across the country. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We cover stories like this one because they matter, because the people at the center of them matter, and because the world deserves to know. Who drives through a quiet residential back road at 2:36 in the morning? Think about that. Most people who are awake at that hour are getting home from a late shift, or rushing to a hospital, or lying in bed counting the ceiling tiles. They are not driving slowly and deliberately through a neighborhood they do not live in, through streets they have no reason to be on, at a speed that suggests they know exactly where they are going and exactly how much time they have to get there. Who does that? Who makes that choice? Who wakes up or stays awake and decides that the early hours of a February morning in a quiet Arizona neighborhood is the right time to do what they did? Who puts on gloves before they leave the house? Who chooses a ski mask? Who thinks through the camera on the front porch, thinks through it deliberately enough to bring something to cover it with? Who plans the route? Who drives it once, twice, 3 times in the days before, memorizing the turns, learning where the streetlights are, figuring out which roads are likely to be empty? These are not the decisions of someone acting on impulse. These are the decisions of someone who thought about this, who sat somewhere at a table, in a car, in a room, and made a plan, step by step, detail by detail, and then executed it against an 84-year-old woman who could not walk 50 yards without a walker. There were 12 vehicles on that back road in the early hours of February 1st. Investigators analyzed every single one. They pulled footage from traffic cameras, neighborhood ring systems, gas station monitors, ATM cameras on nearby commercial streets. They ran plates. They cross-referenced timestamps. They built a minute-by-minute map of every vehicle that moved through that area between midnight and 6 in the morning. And in doing so, they began to narrow the field. Because when you remove the night shift nurses driving home, when you remove the delivery driver who clocked in at 5, when you remove every vehicle that can be explained, accounted for, placed in a normal human context, what you are left with is the vehicle that cannot, the one that does not fit, the one that was there for a reason that nobody has yet been willing to say out loud on the record. They combed through thousands of hours of surveillance footage from surrounding neighborhoods, gas stations, convenience stores, traffic cameras on every major road leading into and out of the foothills. They traced cell tower signals. They put up FBI digital billboards across southern Arizona. They flooded tip lines with requests. They posted on social media. They held press conferences. They put a face, a masked, gloved, backpack-wearing face on every screen they could reach. And still, weeks later, a $1 million reward would go unclaimed. A mother of 3 would remain missing. A family would be left holding yellow ribbons and whispering prayers into the dark. How does someone vanish like that? How does a plan that precise fall apart, or does it? That is what we are here to explore tonight. And we are going to take our time doing it. Because Eleanor deserves that. Her family deserves that. And so do you. To understand what happened to Eleanor, you first have to understand who she was. Not who she was in headlines. Not who she was in press releases or crime bulletins. Who she actually was as a woman, as a mother, as a person who had lived 84 years and filled every one of them with something real. Because it is very easy in stories like this for the victim to become a symbol, a face on a billboard, a name in a chyron. And that is not what Eleanor was. She was a full human being with a history and a laugh and opinions about things and a favorite chair and a habit of calling her grandchildren just to hear their voices even when she had nothing particular to say. She was a person, and the world needs to remember that. She was born in Fort Wright, Kentucky, in the early 1940s, a part of the country that was still shaped by the rhythms of small-town life, where families stayed close and faith was not something you talked about but something you lived inside. She grew up in a generation that knew hard times, a generation that had watched parents stretch $1 across a week and still find something to give away. A generation that did not complain much, because complaining required a kind of leisure that most people could not afford. Eleanor carried that upbringing with her for the rest of her life. It showed in the way she moved through the world quietly, steadily, without demanding anything, without making her struggles into a public performance. She just handled things. That was who she was. She came to Arizona as a young mother in the early 1970s, part of a wave of American families drawn westward by the warmth, the space, the sense that out here in the wide-open desert, a person could build something and have it stay built. She had 3 children. She built a life in Tucson the slow and patient way, through years and decades of showing up, of being present, of making a home that people wanted to come back to. And then before she was ready, before any of them were ready, she lost her husband, Charles. He was 49 years old, gone suddenly while traveling for work in Mexico. No warning, no chance to prepare. Just a phone call, and then a world that was permanently different from the one she had woken up inside that morning. That kind of grief does things to a person. It can hollow them out. It can make them brittle and fearful and closed. It can turn the world into a place that feels too dangerous to love openly. For some people, losing a spouse that young and that suddenly is the thing that defines the rest of their lives, a before and an after with nothing in between. But that is not what happened to Eleanor. By every account from the people who knew her, grief made her softer. It made her more patient. It made her slower to judge and faster to sit down beside someone who was struggling. She had been through the worst thing she could imagine, and she had survived it, and that survival gave her a kind of steadiness that people could feel when they were around her. She became the kind of woman whose door was always open, whose voice was always calm, who could sit with you in the hardest moment of your life and somehow make you feel less alone in it. She had lived in the Catalina foothills neighborhood north of Tucson for decades, long enough that she knew which neighbors kept late hours and which ones were up before sunrise, long enough that the grocery store clerks recognized her and the pharmacist knew her prescriptions by heart, long enough that the neighborhood had become an extension of her, familiar, comfortable hers. She knew the sound of the monsoon season arriving, the way the air pressure changed before a desert storm. She knew which street flooded first when it rained hard. She knew the specific way the light hit the Santa Catalina mountains in the late afternoon, turning them gold and pink and impossible. She had watched that light for 50 years. She loved that light. This was her home in the deepest sense of that word, not just a place where she slept, but a place where she had become herself. Her daughter Savannah was known to millions of Americans as a familiar face on morning television, a journalist with a career built on exactness and warmth, someone who could ask a hard question and somehow still make the person across from her feel respected. But at home, privately, she was simply Eleanor's daughter, the one who called on Sundays, the one who flew back to Tucson whenever she could, the one who posted photos of her mother on social media with the kind of unguarded love that famous people usually keep behind closed doors. Annie, her other daughter, lived just minutes away. She was the one who had dinner with Eleanor most often, who ran the errands and kept the calendar and made sure that her mother's daily life ran smoothly. And Cameron, her son, was the quiet anchor, steady, present, always there when it mattered. This was a family that had been shaped by loss and held together by love. The kind of family where nobody had to announce that they cared. It was simply understood. Eleanor's home was modest by the standards of the surrounding neighborhood. A single-story house tucked into the hills, surrounded by desert landscaping, the kind of low, sculptural plants that survive the Arizona heat without much help. Agave, palo verde, a line of ocotillo along the back fence. The kind of yard that looks spare until you learn to see it, and then it looks exactly right. Inside, the house was full of the accumulated evidence of a long life well lived. Family photographs, books with cracked spines, a chair positioned just so beside a window that caught the afternoon light, the smell of coffee in the morning and the faint trace of the perfume she had worn for 40 years. It was a home that told a story just by existing. And on the morning of February 2nd, when investigators walked through it for the first time, that story had been interrupted in the middle of a sentence. She used a walker to get around the house. She took medication every day for her heart. She could not, as the Pima County Sheriff would later tell reporters in a detail that stopped the room, walk 50 yards on her own without assistance. 50 yards. That is roughly half the length of a football field, the length of about 2.5 driveways. And yet Eleanor was not someone who defined herself by what she could not do. She still attended virtual church services with her friends on Sunday mornings, her tablet propped up on the kitchen table, the service playing through the speakers she had learned to use because her grandchildren had set them up and she had decided at 84 that she was going to figure it out. She still called people just to check in. She still laughed loudly, genuinely, the way people laugh when they are not performing happiness but actually feeling it. She was living, fully, completely, and with every intention of continuing, right up until the night someone made a decision that took that away from her. Let us go back to that Saturday, January 31st. The desert winter in Tucson is different from winter in most of the country. The days are mild, warm enough for a jacket but not a coat. The nights drop down into the 40s, sometimes the 30s, cold enough to remind you that the desert does not owe you anything, cold enough that you feel it on your face when you step outside. Eleanor had spent the evening at Annie's home, just a short drive through the familiar streets of the foothills. They had dinner, they talked. They sat in the comfortable, unhurried way that people sit together when they have all the time in the world and know it. There was no argument, no tension, no premonition of anything. It was just a Saturday night dinner with her daughter, the same way it had been so many Saturday nights before. Annie drove her mother home just before 10 o'clock. The drive was short, A few turns through streets lined with desert landscaping, porch lights glowing amber in the cold, the mountains dark against a sky full of stars. Eleanor got out of the car at her driveway. They hugged. Eleanor walked to her front door with her walker, turned the key, pushed the door open. She looked back. She waved. Annie waited until she was inside, watching through the windshield until the door closed. That was the rule: you wait until they are inside. It is such a small thing, such a basic, human, loving thing, and Annie did it. She watched her mother go inside, and then she drove home and she went asleep, and she did not know. She could not have known that the door closing behind her mother that night was not the end of an ordinary evening. It was the end of something much larger. The hours between 10 o'clock and 2:28 in the morning belong, in the investigation, to the unknown. Eleanor would have gone through her nightly routine, the medication, the careful navigation through the house with her walker, the familiar rituals of a woman who had been putting herself to bed in that same house for decades. She might have watched a little television. She might have read. She might have said a prayer, the way she often did before sleep, quiet words in a quiet house under a quiet desert sky. Nobody knows exactly. Nobody can say. Because the next data point, the next moment that investigators can anchor to a specific time, is 2:28 a.m., and by then, everything had already happened. At 2:28 in the morning, Eleanor's pacemaker disconnects from her Apple devices. Let us sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to gloss over it as a technical detail and miss what it actually means. A pacemaker that is paired with a device maintains that connection through proximity. It is not a wireless signal that travels across a city. It is a short-range connection that requires the wearer to be physically close to the paired device. When the connection dropped at 2:28 a.m., investigators understood something devastating. Eleanor was not just awake. She was not just in another room. She had been moved. The distance between her body and the devices she had paired with her pacemaker had grown large enough to break the signal. She had been taken out of her home at 2:28 in the morning, while her daughter slept a few miles away, while her neighbors slept behind their locked doors, while the rest of the neighborhood breathed slowly in and out in the dark. 8 minutes. At 2:36 a.m., a camera on a back road 2.5 miles from Eleanor's home catches a vehicle moving at high speed through the neighborhood. Investigators do not release the make or model publicly in those first days. They say only that it was moving faster than it should have been, faster than any normal reason for being on that road at that hour would explain. And when they plot the timeline, 2:28, pacemaker disconnects, 2:36, vehicle on back road, that 8-minute window becomes the axis around which the entire investigation rotates. Because in those 8 minutes, someone carried an 84-year-old woman out of her home, put her in a vehicle, began driving away from everything she had ever known. In 8 minutes. While the desert night sat silent around them, try to imagine it. Really try. You are 84 years old. You are asleep in the home you have lived in for decades. The sheets smell familiar. The sounds of the house, the refrigerator hum, the way the heater kicks on, the specific creak of the hallway floor are so known to you that you do not hear them anymore. They are just part of the texture of your nights. And then something wakes you. Or maybe you do not wake at first. Maybe it happens while you are still half inside a dream. And then you are fully awake and there is someone in your home and you cannot run and you cannot fight, and the only thing you can do is try to understand what is happening around you. What would that feel like? What would be going through your mind? We ask not to be cruel. We ask because Eleanor was a real person in a real moment, and the only way to honor that is to refuse to let it become abstract. The doorbell camera footage, when it finally surfaced, confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. The FBI director himself released the images, black and white stills from the camera mounted at Eleanor's front door, capturing a figure in the darkness. Masked, gloved, a backpack over one shoulder. The figure can be seen moving deliberately, first attempting to cover the camera lens with a gloved hand, then reaching into the yard to grab a brush, and using it to smear something across the lens. It is a sequence of actions that takes maybe 45 seconds, maybe a minute, And in those 45 seconds, what you are watching is a person who knows that the camera is there, who came prepared to deal with it, and who is executing a plan that was written before they ever set foot on that porch. Think about that brush. Think about the decision to use a brush from the front yard rather than something they brought themselves. That is either improvisation, noticing the brush, grabbing it, adapting, or it is knowledge, prior knowledge of the yard, of what was kept near the door. Either way, it tells a story. A story about a person who was either very quick and very calm under pressure, or who had been to that porch before. The FBI later confirmed what many investigators had already pieced together. Not all of the images released to the public had been taken on the morning of Eleanor's disappearance. Some of them had been captured on a different night, which means someone came to that house before February 1st. Someone stood at that front door on a prior occasion. To look, to learn, to prepare. How long before the abduction? The FBI did not say. But the question hangs over everything. How many nights had someone stood at Eleanor's door before the night they finally walked through it? Before we go deeper into the investigation, we want to stop for just a moment and ask you something personal. When you first heard about Eleanor's story, whether it was in the news or through a friend or through a video like this one, what was the first thing that went through your mind? Was it fear? Was it anger? Did you think about your own mother, your own grandmother, your own parent living alone somewhere in a quiet neighborhood just like this one? Did it make you want to pick up the phone? Did it make you check the locks on your door? Leave your answer in the comments. We mean it when we say we read every single one. This community is not just a number to us. You are the reason we tell these stories, and we want to hear from you. If this story has your heart in your throat right now, if you are sitting forward in your seat or your chest is tight with something you cannot quite name, go to the comments right now and type the words, "I'm still watching." Let us see who is truly following this timeline with us, because we have only covered the opening chapter of what investigators uncovered. And the deeper we go, the more complicated and the more chilling this story becomes. Stay with us. The response from law enforcement in the hours after Eleanor's disappearance was immediate and massive in a way that even experienced investigators described as unusual. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, the lead agency, was joined by the FBI within the first few hours. The FBI's involvement was significant. This was not a local missing persons case that got handed up the chain. This was a case that, from very early on, investigators treated as something different. Something coordinated. Something that required the full weight of federal resources. U.S. Customs and Border Protection was brought in as well, given the proximity of the area to the Mexican border, a detail that would fuel speculation in the weeks that followed, though investigators were careful never to confirm publicly whether they believed Eleanor had been taken across the border. Search and rescue teams swept the desert. And if you have never seen the desert north of Tucson, you need to understand what that means. The Catalina foothills are not a flat, empty expanse. They are rocky, uneven terrain, arroyos and dry creek beds and dense cactus fields and elevation changes that can defeat a trained hiker on a good day. The teams that went out into that landscape in the February cold were looking for any trace of Eleanor, a piece of clothing, a shoe, anything biological, anything physical that could tell them which direction she had been taken. They found nothing, which was, in its own way, information. It suggested that whoever took Eleanor had not brought her into the desert. It suggested a vehicle, a route, a destination. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood door by door. Every house on every street within a mile radius. Every person who might have been awake at 2 in the morning. Every dog walker, every insomniac, every shift worker coming home. They asked the same questions everywhere. Did you hear anything? Did you see a car that did not belong? Did anything feel wrong, even slightly, even something you dismissed at the time? Most people had nothing. A few had fragments, a sound they could not place, a car they did not recognize, a light on in a window that was usually dark. Investigators took every fragment and tried to fit it into the shape of what they were building. Most did not fit. Some did. Those they kept. The forensic work at Eleanor's home was painstaking. A team spent days inside that single-story house in the foothills, going over every surface, every entry point, every place a person might have touched or moved or left something behind. And then came the detail that stopped everyone who heard it. Blood. Eleanor's blood, confirmed by DNA, was found on her front porch. Not a small amount. Enough that a forensic expert, speaking to reporters, said that blood evidence of that kind, present at the threshold of a home, almost certainly indicated more blood inside. And that blood, with its microscopic information, its DNA, its spatter pattern, the story it told about what kind of force had been used and in what direction, could be the single most important piece of physical evidence in the entire case. Investigators did not release details about what the internal forensics showed, but they kept the DNA running. They kept comparing it to every database available, and they waited. The tip lines opened and the calls did not stop. Within the first 48 hours, investigators were processing tens of thousands of contacts, calls, emails, online submissions, social media messages. People who thought they had seen something. People who knew someone. People with theories. People with genuine information. People who just wanted to help, who could not sit still with the knowledge that an 84-year-old woman was out there somewhere and nobody knew where. Every credible tip had to be checked. Every piece of information had to be evaluated, contextualized, weighed against everything else investigators already knew. It was the work of dozens of agents running simultaneously. A massive, coordinated, exhausting operation. And it was necessary. Because in cases like this, the tip that breaks everything open sometimes comes from the most unexpected place. A neighbor who saw something and almost did not call. A stranger in another city who noticed a detail that did not add up. The one thread that, when pulled, unravels the whole thing. 3 weeks after Eleanor's disappearance, the family announced a $1 million reward for information leading to her safe return. Within a single day, 1,500 new tips came in. More than 700 of them were flagged as credible, meaning they contained specific, verifiable information that investigators had not already accounted for. 700. Think about the work that represents. 700 separate pieces of information, each requiring time and personnel to investigate. Each one a possible path forward. Each one also a possible dead end. Investigators worked through them systematically, quietly, without announcing each development to the press. Because in investigations like this, publicity is a double-edged tool. It brings in information, but it also alerts the people you are looking for. And the last thing any investigator wanted was to tip off whoever had a leaner that law enforcement was getting close. The backpack was everywhere. Once the FBI released the doorbell camera images, analysts across the country began working to identify it. Investigators confirmed relatively quickly that it was an Ozark Trail brand backpack, a product sold at Walmart stores nationwide for under $20. Mass market. Purchased in hundreds of thousands of units across thousands of stores. In most cases, that kind of item is essentially untraceable, but investigators were not looking only at the backpack. They were looking at everything the figure was wearing: the ski mask, the gloves, the jacket, the shoes. Every item was a data point. Every purchase, if made with a traceable method at a store with surveillance cameras, was a thread. Investigators began the work of identifying every component of what that person was wearing and tracing every one of those items back through the retail chain. It was slow. It was meticulous. And it was the kind of work that rarely makes headlines but often makes cases. And then came the ransom notes. Multiple communications, sent to media outlets and to law enforcement, demanding $6 million in cryptocurrency, a specific large number that immediately raised questions among investigators and former FBI analysts who commented publicly on the case. $6 million is not a random figure. It is a number that implies someone had done research, had formed a belief, however accurate, about what the family might be able to access. The demand was accompanied by a deadline, 5 o'clock in the evening on February 9th, a specific day, a specific hour, which suggested, again, a level of planning and calculation that did not fit the profile of an impulsive crime. Ransom demands with deadlines are the work of people who have thought through the logistics, who have a plan for what happens if the deadline is met, and a plan for what happens if it is not. Eleanor's children responded in a video that is almost impossible to watch without feeling something crack open in your chest. Savannah, Annie, and Cameron stood together, three adult children who had grown up watching their mother be the strong one, the steady one, the one who held everything together, and now they were the ones holding each other up. They spoke directly to whoever had their mother. Their voices were controlled in the way that voices are controlled when falling apart is not an option, when you have to stay coherent because coherence might be the thing that saves someone you love. "We are ready to talk," they said. "We are doing everything we can. We need to know she is alive. We need proof of life. Please, reach out." And then they turned to their mother directly, to the camera, as if she might be watching from wherever she was, and said the words that anyone who has ever loved a parent felt in their own body when they heard them. "Everyone is looking for you, Mommy. Everywhere. We will not rest." Few days after that video, a California man was arrested. He had sent communications posing as the kidnapper, fake ransom demands, designed to extract money from a family that was already at its most desperate and most vulnerable. He had no connection to the actual abduction. He had simply seen the story, recognized an opportunity, and decided to exploit a mother's kidnapping for personal gain. The discovery of his fraud was both a relief, at least one threat was neutralized, and a fresh wound. Because it meant that the real ransom communication, if there had been one, was still unconfirmed. It meant that investigators were back to square one on the question of who, if anyone, was genuinely holding Eleanor. And it meant that the family had spent days responding to a man who was lying to them, while the person actually responsible was somewhere else entirely, watching. Former FBI profiler Greg McCrary, a man who has spent decades studying the psychology of serious violent crime, reviewed the publicly available information and offered an assessment that cut through a lot of the speculation. He said clearly and directly that this was a targeted crime, not a random act, not a crime of opportunity, targeted, which means that somewhere in the days and weeks before February 1st, a decision was made to choose Eleanor, specifically, her house, her routine, her daughter's schedule, her front yard and the brush near the door and the doorbell camera mounted at that particular angle. Someone chose all of it. And that raises the question that sits at the center of this entire case, the one that investigators have never stopped asking. Why her? Of all the people in Tucson, in the foothills, in that neighborhood, why this woman? What did someone want from Eleanor, or from her family, badly enough to plan it this carefully and execute it this coldly? Here is the detail that former investigators keep returning to, the one that, more than anything else, distinguishes this case from a crime of opportunity. The driver of that vehicle on the back road did not hesitate. The footage shows a car moving with direction and purpose. No slowing down at unfamiliar intersections. No circling. No pause at street signs. Just movement, assured, direct, deliberate. This was someone who knew exactly where they were going. Someone who had either driven that route before, possibly multiple times, or who had studied it so thoroughly on a map that it felt like memory. Either possibility is deeply troubling because both require the same thing: advanced planning, premeditation, a decision that was not made in the heat of a moment but in the cold, calculated quiet of preparation. The Pacemaker timeline keeps drawing analysts back, because here is what it tells us. The person or persons who entered Eleanor's home knew they were working against a clock. They knew that devices in that house were connected to Eleanor's body. They knew, or strongly suspected, that disconnecting her from her environment would register somewhere. They moved in 8 minutes. They covered the camera. They worked without the kind of hesitation that comes from uncertainty. That is not the behavior of someone improvising. That is the behavior of someone rehearsed. Someone who had walked through the sequence in their mind enough times that the actual event, when it came, felt like repetition rather than improvisation. That kind of psychological preparation does not happen overnight. It is the product of time spent planning, days of it, possibly weeks. And then there is the question of motive, the question that nobody can fully answer yet, and that the absence of an answer makes more disturbing, not less. Former FBI investigators who spoke publicly about the case offered two primary theories, and both of them are worth sitting with. The first is Ransom. Savannah was a nationally known journalist. In the mind of someone who had done superficial research, who had looked at her public profile, her career, the visible markers of a successful life, she might have appeared to be a source of significant money. The $6 million demand suggests someone who believed that the family had access to that kind of wealth. Whether that belief was accurate is almost beside the point. What matters is that someone believed it strongly enough to build a crime around it. The second theory is more personal, and in some ways, harder to hold. That someone with a specific connection to Eleanor's world, to her past, to her family's history, to something that has not yet surfaced publicly, had a motive that went beyond money. A grudge rooted in something old. A fixation that had been building quietly for years. A connection that investigators have been searching for in financial records and old address histories and the deep background of a long life. Neither theory has been confirmed. Neither has been ruled out. Both remain live, standing side by side like doors that have not yet been opened. And until one of them opens, until investigators find the thread that leads to a name, a face, a real human being who made a real decision, Eleanor's family lives in the uncertainty between them. Let us stop here. Because this is the place in the story where it would be easy to retreat into the comfort of analysis, into timelines and evidence chains and investigative procedures, and avoid the thing that is actually hardest to face, which is this: Eleanor is a real person. She was taken from her bed in the middle of the night. She was hurt. We know that from the blood on the porch. She was frightened. And in the weeks after she was taken, her children stood in front of cameras and begged, publicly, without dignity left to protect, without anything left to offer except their own visible grief, turned outward toward whoever had their mother, hoping that the sight of it, the raw, unguarded reality of three adult children begging for their mother's life, would be enough to move someone. If that were your mother, what would you do? If you were Savannah, standing in front of a camera with your voice barely under control and your heart completely shattered, where would you find the words? We are asking because the answer matters. Because imagining ourselves into that position is the only way to truly understand what this family has been carrying. As February turned into March, something shifted in the public nature of the investigation. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department began transitioning field agents toward analytical work, processing the enormous volume of video footage, running DNA comparisons, working through digital and financial records. On the surface, to a casual observer, it might have looked like the investigation was winding down. It was not. Experienced investigators will tell you that this transition, from boots on the ground to analysts at desks, is often where cases actually get solved. The dramatic searches make news. The quiet, painstaking data work makes arrests. And the data in this case was, by multiple accounts, substantial. A retired FBI special agent who had been following the case and commenting publicly on it used a specific phrase, red hot. He said the evidence was red hot. Thousands of hours of video, DNA samples under active laboratory analysis, forensic shoe impressions from the porch and possibly from inside the house, cell tower data that could place specific devices in specific locations at specific times, financial records being traced through multiple systems. The architecture of a case, a real prosecutable case, was being assembled, quietly, methodically, in a way that the public could not see but that investigators and former law enforcement professionals who were watching the case closely recognized as meaningful progress. Closer. Not there yet, but closer. Outside Eleanor's home, the yellow flowers kept arriving. Strangers came and left them at the edge of the driveway, people who had never met Eleanor, who knew her only through a photograph and a name and a story that had reached them through a screen, and settled into them in a way they could not entirely explain. Yellow became the color of this family's hope. Savannah wore it in her public appearances. The staff at her network wore yellow ribbons in solidarity. Friends of the family organized yellow ribbon campaigns in neighborhoods across southern Arizona. It was the kind of spontaneous, uncoordinated community response that emerges when a story touches something universal, when a tragedy strips away everything specific and reveals something that everyone recognizes at the same time. A mother, a family, the unbearable vulnerability of people we love. The flowers said, "We see it, we feel it, we have not looked away." 1 month after Eleanor's disappearance, Savannah and Annie returned to their mother's home for the first time. Cameras captured the moment, the two sisters walking side by side down the driveway, arms linked, moving slowly. They placed yellow flowers at the growing tribute near the front of the property. They held each other. Annie's husband stood beside them, close but quiet, the way people stand close to grief without trying to fix it. The flowers were bright against the winter-pale desert landscape. And in that image, in those two daughters standing in front of the house where their mother should have been, there was something that cut right through everything else. All the analysis, all the investigative detail, all the timelines and the evidence chains and the FBI press conferences. Gone. And in their place, two women standing in their mother's driveway, holding each other, because that was the only thing left to do. Elizabeth Smart was asked about Eleanor's case during a television interview. Elizabeth Smart, who was herself abducted as a 14-year-old girl from her bedroom in Salt Lake City, and who was found alive 9 months later, after a search that the entire nation had followed and that almost everyone involved had feared would not end the way it did. She was asked whether following Eleanor's case was triggering for her, whether it brought things back, and she answered honestly, yes. And then she said something else. She said that the statistics in cases like this are brutal. She acknowledged that. She did not pretend otherwise. But then she said, "I always feel like we cannot give up, because if that was the mentality around my case, I would not be here today." That is not a platitude. That is testimony. That is a woman who knows from the inside what it means to be found when the world had started to believe that finding her was no longer possible. And it is the thread that Eleanor's family has been holding since the very first morning she was gone. Not certainty. Not reassurance, just the refusal to stop. We live in neighborhoods like Eleanor's. Most of us do. We have mothers who wave from front doors. We have grandmothers who still call just to hear our voices. We need to believe that the neighborhood is safe, that the dark outside the window holds nothing worse than a quiet night. We lock our doors and we tell ourselves that locking the door is enough. And most of the time it is. But Eleanor's story asks us to hold two things at once: the truth that most nights are exactly as safe as they feel, and the truth that sometimes, in some houses, on some nights that look exactly like every other night, they are not. And the question that survivors and families and entire communities are forced to ask in the aftermath of a night like Eleanor's is not a practical question. It is not about security systems or neighborhood watch programs. It is something older and harder. How do we keep loving people as openly as Eleanor loved her family, knowing that love also means vulnerability? How do we stay open to the world when the world has shown us what it is capable of? The answer that Eleanor's story offers, the only answer it has, is not a simple one. It is not a checklist or a safety plan. It is something more human. It is the image of two daughters standing in a driveway with yellow flowers. It is the sound of a woman's children saying, into a camera, "We will not rest." It is Elizabeth Smart's voice saying we cannot give up. It is the 700 credible tips that came in on a single day, 700 strangers who had a piece of information and chose, in that moment, to share it. It is the investigators who went home at night and came back in the morning and kept working. It is the neighbors who kept the porch lights on. It is the community that kept showing up quietly with flowers and prayers and the stubborn refusal to let one woman's story become just another file in a cold case drawer. That is the answer, not a solution, not a resolution, just the refusal collectively and individually to give up. We want to ask you something before we close tonight, not as a formality, not as a call to action, as a genuine question from one human being sitting with a story to another. If Eleanor were your mother, if she were the woman who raised you, who sat with you on the worst nights of your life, who knew your face before you knew your own name, what would you do? Not what would you want to do. What would you actually, realistically, humanly be capable of doing? Where would you find the strength to stand in front of a camera and beg? Where would you find the faith to put a yellow ribbon on your door when days turn into weeks and weeks begin to turn into something longer, and the phone still does not ring with the answer you need? How long could you keep hopping? We are asking not because we have an answer. We are asking because hope, when it is tested that hard, is not a feeling. It is a choice. And Eleanor's children made that choice every single morning. Do you believe that what happened to Eleanor was planned from the very beginning, every detail, every minute, every step? Or do you think the investigation will eventually surface something more complicated than it appears? A motive nobody has yet imagined. A connection buried in the past that will suddenly make everything make sense in the worst way possible. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read them. We take them seriously. We think about them. Because this community is not just an audience. You are the people who keep stories like Eleanor's alive, who refuse to let them slide off the front page and into silence, and that refusal matters more than you know. If this story has stayed with you, if you are going to think about it tomorrow, or check for updates, or find yourself reaching for the phone to call someone you love, then subscribe to this channel. Because we are not done with Eleanor's story. We will be here when there are developments. We will be here to tell you what investigators find. We will be here because walking away is not something we are willing to do either. And if you think this story leaves you with questions, and it should wait until you hear what happened in the case where a single receipt left behind at a crime scene cracked open an investigation that had gone cold for 7 years. That story is coming, and it will stay with you the same way this one has. Eleanor's family is still waiting. The yellow flowers are still at the edge of that driveway. The pacemaker data is still sitting in an evidence file alongside thousands of hours of video and DNA samples and financial records and shoe impressions and 700 credible tips. Investigators are still working. The world is still watching. And somewhere out there tonight, in some city or town or quiet desert road that nobody has quite looked at closely enough yet, the answer to what happened inside that house is waiting to be found. We will not stop looking. We hope you will not either. Because Eleanor deserves to come home, and her children deserve to stop holding their breath.